Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading John Locke's second treatise of government. Today we're finishing up the last chapter. We're doing the second part of the last chapter, which chapter 19, which looks at sections 228 to 243, the end of the thing. Yesterday we've read up to we looked up the first part, which dealt to 227. So we broke up an arbitrary point of half of this chapter. This is the longest chapter. I broke it up because even the previous chapter took 2 hours. I want to get 2 hour video, and also I wanted to end this week. This is Friday, and I wanted to end this on Friday. So we turn it. We start Monday. When we look next Monday, we'll be starting the new thing. And at the time of this recording, I'm leading to something, but I'll make my announcement probably this weekend, and I will say something about it. So that I haven't you by time when you see this next Friday, the I think was it November Friday November 11th. And for Poland, that's Europe. It's Veterans Day in the United States, or not, they make that. This is the end of the First World War, November 11th. This is for Poland. It's their Independence Day when they created their national independence. So I'm in Poland. I live in Poland now for over 20 years, and this will be their big Independence Day. It's the end of they came back. They got their independence as a nation, the reconstitution as a nation after partition at the end of the 18th century by the three-year major, Prussia, Russia, and Austria. They are now in 1918. They got their independence back at the end of World War One. One of the 14 points. So therefore, today is that the 11th of November for you watching this right now, and so for Poles out there, happy Independence Day and happy Nipolagości. My American, for my British friends, happy Remembrance Day, because it's not really Remembrance Day for them. That's usually Sundays. So probably this coming next Sunday, 13th, will probably be Remembrance Day if I know the British right. Everyone else, this is Veterans Day in America. Veterans Day, but usually it's on a Monday also. But this is the Armistice Day or Veterans Day. This is the end of the First World War. By that time, sometime this week, sometimes you'll get a notice about what I'm doing next. So I haven't made up my mind yet. This is doing this about a week ahead of time. So I'll be doing my new thing. But today we're finishing up Locke, the second treatise, and particularly chapter 19 on the dissolution of government. Okay, we dealt up the first half. Now we finished that section. We finished that section 227 last time. So let's take up 228, and that was the idea of whoever who the rebels. The true rebels are the one who 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 break the law and exercise arbitrary force or do things. It's not the people who oppose it, but those who the prince or the legislature who have used unlawful authority or unlawful force to deprive the subjects or people of their lives, liberties, or their property. Right. So therefore, we're getting to this. Right. 228. But if they who say that it lays a foundation for rebellion, that was the right to rebel and the right to think, mean that it may occasion civil wars or intestine broils, to tell the people that they are absolved from obedience when illegal attempts are made upon their liberties or properties, and may oppose the unlawful violence of those who were their magistrates when they invade their properties contrary to the trust put into them, and that therefore this doctrine is not to be allowed, being so destructive to the peace of the world. They may as well say, upon the same grounds, that honest men may not oppose robbers or pirates, because this occasion disorder or bloodshed. Because this may occasion disorder and bloodshed. In other words, If you argue that you should not be able to say you have a right to revolution, then you can't oppose anyone acting against you. Again, this is a classic. Either I'm right, either you let me do this, or you really believe this horrible thing. This is a trick. This is a classic rhetorical device. It's an extreme either or. In other words, either you have a right to revolution. If you don't believe in this right to remove the government, then you really believe that you have no right to oppose robbers because it might cause violence. Okay, this is the kind of typical Locke trick, Locke argument, right? This either or. It's a nice, powerful, rational thing, but there's a lot of gap between saying that there's a right, and even he admits this. In other words, he's not going to say for transient regions or anything. The problem is if you take this as the danger here is that it leads to that kind of logic. In other words, the problem is the argument against, in other words, logical rational models tend to be axiomatic. So therefore, by arguing this kind of deductive axiomatic rational model that he's kind of done here, um, leads to kind of an either or in this case, either A or B, right? And therefore, but his argument against that, this is, in other words, there's a lot of that really people put up with a lot. People, well, he in his own way earlier has given realm to prudence, but a prudence that is not by no means, in other words, it's exception. In other words, he adds prudence on top of the logic. In other words, the logic, in other words, the mechanism of logical justification does not have any room for the prudence. It needs it, but it's not a part of it. This is the danger of the Lockean position, because once you accept the Lockean logic, then what happens is that these exceptions you're dealing. The real hardcore logician and logical guy will say, no, Mr. Hey, Locke, you're being inconsistent here. Let's be consistent. I accept your argument, I accept your position, but let's take it to its logical thing and let's stay with the axioms, right? This is why someone like you can say all political philosophy really ends with Hobbes, right? Locke is really kind of correcting Hobbes. Rousseau will correct Hobbes and Locke. Kant will correct Rousseau and then Hobbes and Locke. Hegel similar, and Rawls, right? Even Foucault. Foucault is kind of like Hobbes but inverted. Rawls and Nozick are kind of Locks, different types of Locke, different directions. Hobbes and Locke again. Much of social contract theory is found within much of political thought. So, in other words, there's an old. There was this Whitefoot. I forget. Oh, come on. There's this old English philosopher who was an analytic philosopher, very Whitehead. Whitehead said all philosophy are footnotes to Plato, right? Well, all modern political thought is footnotes to Hobbes in this sense. So let's just continue here. In other words, you have honest men may not oppose pirates because this occasion may disorder blood. If any mischief comes in such cases, it is not to be charged upon him who defends his own right, but upon him that invades his neighbor. So therefore, in other words, you don't blame the victim. Don't blame the victim. That's what he's saying. Don't blame the victim. If you think this is wrong, well, it's not the victim's fault trying to defend himself. It's the one who aggressor, the one who violated the law, who violates it. If the innocent, honest man must quietly quit all he has for peace sake, to him who will lay violent hands upon it, I desire it may be considered what a kind of peace there will be in the world, which consists only in violence and rapine, and which is to be maintained only for the benefit of the robbers and the oppressors. Again, this is a nice classic. What kind of peace? If you're saying I can't do this because of the violence, then what kind of world is this peace? Because if we can't do it, in other words, people can't defend themselves and protect themselves because violence may be done. Therefore, this is what? This is that therefore honest men must quit because of peace, and therefore anyone who the guilty are able to do their what they will, but good men must. And this is that famous line from, this is that famous line from Karl Marx, that civilization puts it that only the barbarians can resort to self-defense, because once we become civilized, we think, oh, it's barbaric to use force to defend ourselves. So therefore, in civilized world, our civilization makes it such that we all become susceptible to tyranny in that sense, because we look at those who will use violence to protect their lives and their liberty as barbarians. How dare they? If they were civilized, they would just submit to the authority, man. Oh my God, they use violence. Oh my, violence is so horrifying to these people that they think that, oh, whips and chains are better, man. Sadomasochism, whips, chains, and bondage, baby. Foucault, Michel Foucault likes it whipped and chained and everything. Power's that. You can't escape power, baby. Power is power, and therefore it doesn't matter. It's always going to be the one who has it and the one who doesn't. And if you change it, then the one who didn't have it before now has it, and he will just be abusive as the other ones. That's the whole point of modern thought, and that power is power, and power means domination, and you can't escape it. So it's mastery. It's all sadomasochism, baby, and that's the problem with in modern political thought. And this is the problem with postmodern thought, because it's all nihilism. There's no positive thing. Like, this is what Paul Ray is. This is a very good interview with the John Anderson's, on YouTube recently, and I thought it was great. He said that the much of like Obama and much of the progressive left and their attack on American institutions are just nihilistic. They have a critique, but no positive critique. The old communists had a vision. They had a positive goal that they had. It was wrong, but at least they had a vision. That today's left only has a kind of vague idea of a perfect world where everything is just, but not a specific vision. And therefore they reject the current world as the existent order is just unjust and wrong and wicked and must be overthrown. In other words, this is the problem in this sense, and this is why Locke is trying to suggest that, okay, in life, you can't do this kind of pure thinking of this bloodshed. You say, oh my God. So Locke is making fun. Locke here does this kind of reductio ad absurdum. Now, this is a classic reductio ad absurdum. He's made absurd the position that if you oppose the right to revolution because it does violence, and therefore that means you shouldn't do ever violence, and therefore robbers should be able to do what they want, and rapists do. Justice, peace means letting robbers and rapists do what they want. Because, in other words, but that's insane in that sense. He's made a reduction ad absurdum. In other words, this is a classic argument of reductio ad absurdum. So therefore, that peace, which is to be maintained only for the benefit of robbers and oppressors, who would not think it admirable, an admirable peace betwixt the mighty and the mean, when the lamb without resistance yields his throat to be torn. It's a great line, to be torn by the imperious wolf. Polymarchus is dead gives us a perfect pattern of such a peace and such a government, whereas Ulysses and his companions had nothing to do but quietly to suffer themselves to be devoured. This is from Odysseus, right? The Odyssey, right? The story of Polymarchus' den is that place in the Odyssey. I'm going to take this note here. This is Odyssey, Book 9, where this is the Cyclops, one-eyed guy, Cyclops, who then puts everyone in the thing and eats them one at a time. And therefore, it was the line is the one-eyed man is king among the blind, right? No doubt Ulysses, who was a prudent man, preached up passive obedience and exhorted them to quiet submission by representing to them of what a concernment peace to was to mankind by shewing the inconvenience that might happen if they should offer to resist Polyphemus, who who had now the power over them. In other words, in other words, he talks about in other words, he's making mockery of this, right? In other words, in other words, then you have to remember what happened. He tricks the Odysseus tricks the Cyclops and blinds him, right? And then they all escape, right? They don't say, "Hey," Odysseus doesn't say, "Hey, everyone, just let's say stay here and let's don't do nothing." Odysseus plots to trick him and then get in a situation where he blinds him, and then once blinded, they can escape. Right? That's how they escape. In other words, Section 229. The ends of government is the good of mankind. So the purpose of government is the good of mankind, which is best for mankind. That the people should always be exposed to the boundless wills of tyranny, or that rulers be sometimes liable to be oppressed. Again, neither are the. Which is, since government is about the good of mankind, what is best for mankind? And neither are. Is it better for mankind that people should always be bound by arbitrary government and exposed to tyranny, or that rulers should be sometime oppressed? And when they grow exorbitant in their use of power and employ it for the destruction and not the preservation of the people. See, he makes a dichotomy, and the reason it's kind of reasonable to this. In other words, but the argument, in other words, he does this purposefully. He gives us two things: one absurd situation and something that's a little less absurd. And therefore, you make a choice. Is that really a choice? It's a trick. It's rigged. The example here is rigged. It's not a real choice. 230. Nor let anyone say that mischief can arise from hence, as often as it shall please a busy head or a turbulent spirit to desire the alteration of the government. It is true, such men may stare whenever they please, but it will only to their own just ruin and perdition. For till the mischief be known general, and the ill designs of the ruler become visible to all, and their attempt sensible to the greater part of the people, who are more disposed to suffer than right themselves by resistance, are not apt to stir. In other words, they're not going to stir. People are not going to get up until they're forced to. In other words, this is the point. Actually, this is Lenin's point, isn't it? That what revolution? If you have to wait for the people to cause the revolution, it ain't going to happen. Because the people will sit by, the people will be just lazy and not happen, and they'll wait to the last moment, and maybe not, they'll be too late to do it. This is why you need a revolutionary vanguard in Lenin. Lenin, the party, is the vanguard made of elites or new elites, or soon to be new elites, who will prod and move the people to revolution, right? So therefore, this is the whole point of Lenin. Lenin in many ways says, Locke, your idea about this people are too lazy in that sense. It'll be too late. They won't. They're not going to resist tyranny. They're going to put up with it. You're right. They will. But that's bad. Your own argument forces us that we have to do this. In other words, we have to fix Locke's imperfection. In other words, this is interesting. If the civil society and commonwealth is the needed construction to, right, in the state of nature, it's not Hobbes's all against all. It's just imperfect. It doesn't, everyone is left to themselves, and this is imperfect. And therefore, things are not really perfectly secure, and that therefore we create society to make up for the imperfection. In other words, for Hobbes, it's fucked in nature. You're just war of all against all, and you're not safe. You're living in terror. It is so excess, the fear of death and your imminent demise and your lack of safety and security. It just drives you to a fear that wants you to escape it. So therefore, you create society to escape nature in that sense. Locke, nature is not that bad. It's just imperfect, and we create this to get a perfection, right? So therefore, it's not a total rejection of nature for society, because for Locke, there's law, there's justice in nature. It's just imperfect; it can't help itself, and we create society in order to, and nature. Therefore, there's natural right. There's these rights by nature. This is what the laws of nature tells us. Government should execute in that sense, right? This is the Lockean logic, right? Um, the problem, Hobbes would say that's nonsense. There's no justice. This is where Hobbes and Locke kind of disagree. There's no real justice, Hobbes argues, in nature. It is simply the war of all against all. Now, Locke does get us to that war of all against all, because of what happens is there's going to be people who will want to take things, and they won't listen to right reason. They become beasts, and therefore they will take from others. They use force. They'll become like beasts and harm others, but in the state of nature, uh, everyone is left to their own self. They're both the judge of their own self and the executant of self, and they join together to protect themselves against those who are doing them harm. Therefore, they create society. They create the body. They create the Commonwealth. Right. That's the whole Lockean project, and therefore, this is the whole the thrust of the logic. Right. And therefore, okay, you create society for the benefit of this. Okay, great. If that's the case, then what happens here? Then what is it? This is in other words, he says here that in other words, you can't be blamed, right? This is the idea that the resistance of it, you participate in justice and oppression here. Unfortunate man is not going to do that, right? They're not going to resolve this. They're going to be too afraid to do this. They're going to be too afraid to put up with this, right? For the examples of injustice, the oppression here and there of an unfortunate man moves them not. So therefore, they have to wait till the people are themselves. They're not up to stir. The examples of particular injustice or oppression here or there of an unfortunate man moves them not. But if they universally have but if they universally have a persuasion, grounded upon manifest evidence that designs are carrying on against their liberties, and and the general course and tendency of things cannot but give them strong suspicions of evil intentions of their governors. Who is to be blamed for it? Who can help it if they, who might avoid it, bring themselves into this suspicion? They are the people to be blamed if they have the sense of they have the sense of rational creatures and of and can think of things no otherwise than as they find and feel them. In other words, they can. In other words, are people to be blamed if they have their rational the sense of rational creatures and they have and can think of things no otherwise than they have find them and feel them? And is it not rather their fault who puts the things into such a posture that they would not have them a thought to be as they are? In other words, those who do it, those who create the situation that get people to think this way. In other words, the people, who's to blame? Is the people, are the people are to blame because this argument is saying that the people's their senses the one level is that they're not going to act in time. They're not going to stir. They're not going to stir. They're not going to do it. And that the suffering of one or two people aren't going to do. But then I talked about this last time also. Remember that line from the German Protestant minister? I can't forget his name, but he said that famous line about that the Nazis came after the Jews, but I was not Jewish. I didn't bother. They came after the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't fight oppose them. Then they came after the trade unions and those people, and I wasn't a member of those unions. And then when they finally came after me, there was no one left to protect me. This is the problem of the small argument that the real destruction of liberty can be done through the small slices of sausage. You want to take the sausage, don't attack the sausage. Just slice it, slice it. People won't object to the small slices. That's how tyranny is brought upon a society, by small slices, not by the big slices. So he says what? They're not stirred. And it says that in examples, they're not going to bother with that. So who can be blamed? who to blame is this? Who's to blame for this condition of this? Blame the people who make it, he's saying. Right? It's not the people to be blamed for this because they feel what they feel. They feel their liberties and their properties are being taken away from them, and they get this feeling by the effects of what is being done. They see the effects and they feel the effects, and they therefore fear emerges in them because them feeling the effects. And therefore they get the suspicion by looking at what's going on, and the actions of what's going on leads them to fear, right? And therefore, people to be blamed if they have the written. He says there, right? He says, and is not the fault who put the things into posture, right? He says, blame those who did this, right? I grant that pride, ambitions, and the turbulency of private men have sometimes caused great disorders in a commonwealth, and factions have been fatal to states and kingdoms. So I'm going to grant that private actors and their private interests in great men can create factions, and factions can lead to what? To great disorders in commonwealth, and these factions have been fatal to states and kingdoms. But whether the mischiefs hath oftener brung in the people's wantonness. In other words, but whether the mischief hath often, or more often, begun in the people's wantonness and a desire to cast off lawful authority of their rulers, or in the rulers' insolence and endeavors to get and exercise arbitrary power over their people. In other words, what is it? Is it because the people doesn't want to be obeyed? What is the real cause of this? Is it the people's wantonness? Are people just lazy and don't like taking orders, and therefore they're going to rebel against the authority of their rulers and the people who they themselves may have authorized? In other words, people's wantonness and desire to cast off lawful authority of their rulers? Or is it the ruler's insolence and desires to cast off lawful authority, to exercise? In other words, it is the ruler's insolence and endeavors to get and exercise arbitrary power of people. Right? Now, whether oppression or disobedience gave the first rise to the disorder, I leave to the impartial history to determine. So, what is it? Is it the one or the other? Is it the disobedience that leads to disorder, or is it this is going to? This I am sure. Whoever, either ruler or subject, by force goes about to invade the rights of either prince or people, and lays the foundation for overturning the constitution and frame of any government, is justly guilty of the greatest crime, I think, a man is capable of, being to answer for all those mischiefs of blood, rapine, and desolations which the breaking to pieces of government bring on a country. And he who does it is justly to be esteemed the common enemy and pest of mankind, and to be treated according. Now, this is the idea. This is the old Roman rule of the pirate. The pirate is an enemy of humanity, and a common enemy of humanity is a pest of mankind. The pirate is someone who is just simply someone who violates the peace of trust. Right? These are enemies of mankind and are to be opposed. And no mercy should be shown to. They are beasts. They are beasts, wild animals in the sense, the argument of the old Locke goes. The beasts are not to be reasoned with. The beasts are to be killed and suppressed. The beasts are not to be reasoned with. They can't reason with beasts. You can't contract with beasts. You can't reason or contract with a beast. They are only to have force applied to them. So therefore, if you're dealing with people who are beasts, you cannot rely on reason in this. You must respond with force. And hence, therefore, those who's going to, in other words, those who engage in this willful, either they do so through laziness and disobedience, or through ambition and endeavor to bring the dissolution of government, break government apart. This is the person who's done what? They're going to bring this will bring all this great suffering of people getting killed, of revolution, which means people dying, civil war. All this is what, and war is murder, death, killing people, blood, raping, and destruction. Okay, taking things, and that's war. And he who does this, who creates this condition, right, who leads to this situation, is justly condemned as a common enemy and pest of mankind, and be treated accordingly. 231, that subjects of foreigners attempting by force on the properties of any people may be resist by force is agreed to all hands, but that magistrates doing the same thing must be resisted, may be resisted, hath of late been denied, as if those who had the greatest privileges and advantages by the law had therefore power to break those laws, by which alone they were set in better place than their brethren, whereas their offenses is therefore the greater, being both as being ungrateful to for the greater share they have by the law, and by breaking also the trust which has been put in their hands by their brethren. In other words, they've been put in authority, they put them in a situation, and what they're doing, they're breaching that trust. They're not they're instead of doing things for common benefit, they're doing things for their own benefit, right? Or the benefit of some partner, some secret colliding and contriving to impose arbitrary situation on the people, right? All this is what those who break those laws by which they were set in a better place. They've broken trust, they've broken faith. Those who don't do their job and they fail to do this. So therefore, this idea Locke would say when Biden and city officials, when government officials refuse to obey the law or they refuse to uphold the law that they are sworn to enforce, they are causing harm. They are committing a crime. Their crime is they broke the trust and that they've been given to them. And therefore you don't have to obey them. Now, you should not necessarily use force against them. You should appeal to the courts and magistrates. But if the magistrates don't refuse to do things, and he then and his instruments of authority, of his police and his power of the Justice Department, then uses the power of the state and the federal government to punish people who do this. Isn't this him declaring war? Isn't the war, in one sense, isn't by using the Justice Department, the January 6th committee, isn't Biden administration waging war on American people? That's what Locke would say. This is a possible argument from Locke. So, people make fun of Michael Anton. Michael Anton is only repeating Locke. Michael Anton is just following the logic of Locke here. And many of the people who are arguing this is the Lockean logic. Now, I have a problem with Lockean logic. I think it's too simplistic. But I think there is civil war. There is going to be civil war if you keep on doing this. So Locke is not completely wrong here. It is that there's no, in other words, that Locke's solution is problematic. I think Locke, in many ways, is repeating what Aristotelian political reasoning argues. I think that is the case. He does this to kind of mask his argument. But his own argument often uses these kind of tricks to kind of protect his position here about property is the end all. In other words, you can't touch property. Can't touch property. In other words, you can do other things, but you can't touch property. In other words, but when does property become the mechanism of the harming the public interest? Somebody's wealth and property becomes so detrimental to them believing that they have arbitrary power over others. Isn't that the whole point of it? Is that the danger of this is that power? It doesn't property and wealth give people the perception of power that they will then abuse it? Then and if private wealth is just as much as a threat to the public good as state power, then to what degree do you have a state then? Commonwealth, Locke would argue, right? That's the whole point. So, in other words, let's continue. 232. Whosoever uses force without right, and as everyone, whoever uses force without right, as everyone in a society who does it without law, puts himself in a state of war with those against whom he uses it. And in the state, in that state, all former ties are canceled. All other rights cease. And everyone has a right to defend themselves and to resist the aggressor. So, okay, let's stop here. So therefore, the thing about here is that in a society, if you use force without right, you've dissolved the social contract. In other words, this is the problem. Is as everyone does in a society. In other words, who does it without law. So if you have no law, but wait a minute, what about prerogative? What about prerogative? Prerogative is a exercise of discretionary force or act for the sake of the public good. Here he makes no at 232. Locke does not distinguish between the force that is done for the common good, the force that is not that is done against the common good. Here, maybe he should put a bracket: the force done against the common good, right? This is what he's assuming. I think this is what he's argued elsewhere. But here he's not doing that. So therefore, someone could reasonably saying all force is that. So therefore, prerogative, you can unread the prerogative chapter and saying, oh my God, you can't have prerogative. No, 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 no. But by the way, that's what Kant does. Kant and the Neo-Kantians will look at this kind of logic saying, oh, no, no, no. Force without right, no law without law, there's no anything without law, so is force without right. So prerogative, bye bye, must go away. Always law, no action. If you don't, in other words, the Locke was smarter than that. In other words, this is where the Kant and the Neo-Kantians radicalize this principle and take it in a direction that Locke himself said would be stupid, right? So this is that weird thing here that we have. Even is this so? Even this. Sorry, even this. Sorry, this. I should wear my glasses. It's my dyslexia. Pardon me. This is so evident that Berkeley himself, that great assessor of the power and sacredness of kings, is forced to confess that it is lawful for the people in some cases to resist their king, and that too in a chapter wherein he pretends to shew that the divine law shuts up the people from all manners of rebellion. So this is a very interesting. Now, let's see who's Berkeley. It's, oh, there's some good notes about the other chapter. I'm sorry, I didn't look at it then. 231. Beyond, what is that? Berkeley. Yeah, Berkeley. William Berkeley published two works, 1600 and 1609, that defended the divine rights of king. Locke that thus quotes from an absolute um, absolutist to show that even such men are compelled to admit some right of resistance or openly justified even tyranny, however terrible. In the original form of the true treatise, Locke gives first gives the Latin text and then the English translation. I have eliminated Latin to save the space. Is brought. It's see Berkeley's De Regio Mark Monaco Marco Macamus, 1600, Book 3, Chapter 8. So this is the quote. And I'm not going to quote the Latin. I'll be just butchering the Latin. So, so Berkeley himself asserted the great asserted of great power. In other words, that is lawful for people in some cases to resist. Right? He uses the where it is evident, even by his own doctrine, that since they may in some case resist, all resistance of prince is not rebellion. His words are this, and it's, I'm not going to do this. This is the quote. This is right there, the whole quote from Latin. Let's go shift over here. Again, this is like this. The English is thus. Now he gives the Latin and he gives the English. English is thus. But if anyone should ask, must the people then always lay themselves open to the cruelty and rage of tyranny? This they must. They must see their cities pillaged and laid to ashes, their wives and children exposed to a tyrant's lust and flurry, and themselves and families reduced to by their king to ruin and all miseries of want and oppression, and yet sit still? Must men alone be debarred from common privileges of opposing reports, which nature allows so freely to other creatures for their preservation of injury? I answer, self-defense on my part is part of nature's law and may be denied in the community even against the king himself, but to avenge themselves upon him they by no means be allowed them, it being not agreeable to that law. Wherefore, if the king shall show his hatred, not only to some particular person, but sets himself against the body of the commonwealth, whereof he is the head, and shall, with intolerable ill usage, cruelly tyrannize over the whole, or a considerable part of the people. In this case, the people have a right to resist and defend themselves from an injury. But it must be with this caution that they can only defend themselves, but do not attack their prince. They may repair the damages received, but must not, for any provocation, exceed the bounds of due reverence and respect. They may repulse the present attempt, but must not revenge past violence. For it is natural for us to defend life and limb, but that an inferior should punish a superior is against nature. The mischief which is designed, then, people may prevent before it is done, but when it is done, they must not revenge it on the king, though author of the villainy. This, therefore, is the privilege of the people in general, above what any private person hath, and particular men are allowed by our adversaries themselves. Buchanan only accepted Buchanan, to have no other remedy but patience. But the body of the people may, with respect, resist intolerable tyranny. For when it is but moderate, they ought to endure it. In other words, this idea that they ought to endure it. So, what is he saying here? That this is the now he's giving Buchanan here. He's Buchanan. In other words, Berkeley is Berkeley here is this idea of monopoly. He's absolutist. He's quoting an absolutist to show even absolutist gives exceptions to this, right? So therefore, thus section 234. Thus far, that great advocate of monarchical powers allows of resistance. It is true. He has annexed two limitations to it, to no purpose. First, he says it must be with reverence. Secondly, it must be without retribution or punishment. And the reason he gives for this is because an inferior cannot punish a superior. First, how to resist force without striking again, or how to strike with reverence. Will need some skill to make intelligible. In other words, now he's mocking. In other words, he used it to show that it is. Now he's saying, well, but he's doing it, but he's making it. Must be done with reverence. How do you strike someone in order to you have to strike someone? How do you strike someone? This is mockery. He's now mocking Berkeley in a sense. Without striking, or how to strike with reverence. You need some skill to making that. He that shall oppose an assault only with a shield to receive the blow, or any more respectful posture, without a sword in his hand to abate the confidence and force of the assailant, will quickly be at the end of his resistance, and will find such a defense serve only to draw on himself the worst usage. This is a ridiculous way of resisting, as Juvenal thought. As Juvenal thought it of fighting. In other words, as Juvenal. Juvenal here does not mean young person. He means Juvenal the thing. He says, "U Platus ergo versions. In other words, this is that famous line from Juvenal, which he doesn't translate, but I'm going to translate here with. Um, Now, Juvenal, this is the Sacropolit. Locke quotes from the Satires 3, verses 289 to 90, 299, 301. The the situation Juvenal describes um, is the encounter of a poor, honest citizen with a drunken bully on the dark street at night. Whether you venture to say anything or make off silently, it's all one. He will thrash you, just the same, and then, in a rage, take bail from you. Such is the liberty of the poor man, having been pounded and cuffed into a jelly. He begs and prays to be allowed to return home, but with a few teeth in his head. Okay, this is the translation of that passage, right? In other words, putatum. The success of the combat will be unavoided the same as he describes here. Libertas populum. This is that line here, right? Resistance. In other words, tus pulis ergo vacuus tano, right? And he goes, liberty of paupers is this. To kind of, go home with a few teeth in your head still, right? Um, this will always be the evident of such imaginary resistance, when men may not strike again. He, therefore, who may resist, must be allowed to strike. And then let our author or anybody else join a knock on the head or cut in the face with such a reverence and respect as he thinks fit. He that can reconcile blows and reverence may, for aught I know, desire his pains, a civil, respecting cudgeling wherever he may meet with it. In other words, saying he's a sadist. He's accusing Berkeley of being a masochist. This is Locke at his kind of vindictive. He uses Berkeley to make a point, and then he turns the knife to use on him, saying, "How can you? You're just sitting here being beat up." He throws Juvenal's example of this. That I'm going to just be beaten the pulp. No, no, no. You can't do that. You have to be able to use force to protect yourself, and that means that you have to use the sword to scare off the king. And how are you going to do revelance with blows back? And therefore, he can recur blows when reverence may, for aught I know, desire the pain. That's in respect to bloodshed wherever he can meet with him. Secondly, as to the second, an inferior cannot punish a superior. That is true, generally speaking, while he is superior. But to resist force with force, being in the state of war, that levels the parties, cancels all former relations of reverence, respect, and superiority. And then the odds that remain is that he who opposes the unjust aggressor has this superiority over him, that he has a right which he prevails to punish the offender, both for the breach of the peace and the evil that followed upon it. Berkeley, therefore, in another place, more coherently to himself, denies that it be lawful to resist a king in any case, but he there assigns two cases whereby the king may unking himself. In his words, now this is again the Latin. I'm not going to quote the Latin. I'm going to skip, and then he gives this big Latin quote here. Two sections. Again, this is from Monarch. This is another big quote from that. Again, I'm not going to quote This this is from Book 3, Chapter 16 of the same book that Barclay. And then he goes, this is at section, this is at, he does this at, again, this is at 336 to 337. No, sorry, 236 to 237 here. So therefore the Latin first is here, and then he goes over here. What then what then can there no case happen where the people may of right and by their own authority help themselves take arms and set upon their king, imperiously domineering over them? None at all, while he remains a king. Honor the king, that he may resist the power, resist ordinance of God, our divine oracles that will never permit it. The people, therefore, can never come by a power over him unless he does something that makes him cease to be a king. For then he divests himself of the crown and dignity and returns to the state of a private man and becomes, and the people become free and superior, and the power with which they had in the interim before they crowned him king, devolving to them. But there are but but there are but few miscarriages which bring this the matter to this day. After considering it on all it well on all sides, I can find but two cases there are, I say, whereby the king ipso facto, becomes no king and loses all power or regal authority over his people, which are to be taken notice of by Woodsarus. Woodsarus is Peter Laslett, in his addition to second notices that Locke has miscopied. In the original reference is the Nicean Winzet, a Catholic writer. So therefore, this is Winzet, a Catholic writer. This is a text. Laswell argues, Peter Laswell in the critical edition makes a note about this. Okay, and this is a different, and he might even say who this is, the Catholic writer. He's quoting authority of a Catholic writer. The first, in other words, this guy is, in other words, not Locke is quoting Catholic, but Barclay is quoting a Catholic writer. Okay, so it's a Catholic, wrong religion. The first is, if the endeavor to overturn the government, that is, if he has a purpose and design to ruin the kingdom and commonwealth, as it is recorded of Nero, that he resolved to cut off the Senate and the people of Rome, lay the city waste with fire and sword, and then remove to some other place. And of Caligula, that he openly declared that he would no longer said that he would be no longer a head to the people or the Senate, and that he had it in his thoughts to cut off the worthless men of both ranks, and then retired to Alexandria. And he wished that the people had but one neck, that he might dispatch them all at one blow. Such designs as these, when any king harbors in his thoughts, and Sirius promotes, he immediately gives up all care and thoughts of the commonwealth, and consequently forfeits the power of governing the subjects, as a master does the dominion over his slaves whom he has abandoned. And 238. In the other such case, when a king makes himself a dependent upon another, and subjects his kingdom, which his ancestors left him, and the people put free in his hands, to the dominion of another. For however, perhaps it may not be his intentions to prejudice the people, yet because he has lost the principal part of his regal dignity, viz., to be the next and immediate under God, supreme in his kingdom, and also because he betrayed or forced his people, whose liberty he ought to have carefully preserved, unto the power and dominion of a foreign nation. By this, as it were, and if this alienation of his kingdom, he himself loses the power he had in it before, without transferring any the least rights to those whom he would have bestowed it. And so by this act sets the people free and leaves them at their own disposal. One example to this is to be found in the Scottish Annals, the Scots Annals. In section 239, in these cases, Berkeley, the greatest champion of absolute monarchy, is forced to allow that the king may be resisted and cease to be king. That is, in short, not to multiply cases in whatsoever he has no authority. There he is no king, and may be resisted. For whomsoever the authority ceases, the king ceases too, and becomes like other men who have no authority. And these two cases, he insists in, differ little from those above mentioned, to be destructive to governments, only that he has omitted the principle for which his doctrine flows, that is, the breach of trust, in not preserving the form of government agreed on, and in not intending the end of government itself, which is the public good and preservation of property. When a king is dethroned himself and puts himself in a state of war with his people, what shall hinder them from prosecuting him who is no king, as they would any other man who has put himself into a state of war with them? Berkeley and those of his opinion would do well to tell us. This father I desire may be taken notice out of Berkeley, that he says the mischief that is designed them, the people may prevent before it be done. Thereby he allows resistance when tyranny is but a design. Such design as these, says he, when any king harbors in his thoughts and seriously promotes, he immediately gives up all cares and thoughts of commonwealth. So that according to him, Berkeley, the neglect of the public good is to be taken as evidence of such design, or at least for sufficient cause of resistance. And the reason of all, and the reason of all, he gives in these words, because he betrayed or forced the people whose liberty he ought to carefully to have preserved. What he added into the power and dominion of a foreign, when he adds in the power and dominions of a foreign nation, signifies nothing. The fault and forfeiture lays in the loss of their liberty, which he ought to have preserved, and not in the distinction of the person to whom dominion they were subject. The people rightly is equally invaded, and their liberty lost, whether they are made slaves to their own or a foreign nation. And it and it and in this lies the injury, and against this only have the right of defense. So Locke is this working out from Berkeley's own argument, giving him kind of filling in the blank of the logic that he gives. He says, well, the problem is that the king has failed to preserve the people, preserve their safety and their property, which is his trust. We're supposed to do. The minute he fails, it doesn't matter if it's a foreigner or he himself imposes tyranny. That once he does this, he's no longer king, and there's a private person because he wages war on the people by this use of exercising of unlawful authority. And in other words, once he engages in this kind of plot to harm the people, to breach the the commonwealth, and then so therefore this is what. And these are the incidents to be found in all countries. In other words, the people right is equally invaded and their liberty lost, whether they are made slaves to any of their own or foreign nations. And this lies the injury. And against this, they have the right to defense. And there is an instance to be found in all countries, which show that it is not the change of nations and the persons of their governor, but the change of government that gives the offense. Blilson, bishop of our own church, and a great stickler for the power and prerogatives of princes, does, if I mistake not, in his treatise of Christian subjection, acknowledges that prince may forfeit their power and their title to obedience of their subject, and if needed authority in a case where reason is so plain, I should send my reader to Bracton, Fortescue, and the author of The Mirror, and others writers that cannot be suspected of to be ignorant of our government or enemies to it. In other words, he's now saying here, this is again, he's going to send them to the fathers of English law. Now, this is actually very important. In other words, what is this? So, Thomas Bilson, the Bishop of Renchester, he was a harsh critic of Catholicism. So this is Bilson, right? Right. Bracton, Henry de Bracton, from basically dies at 1268. I think he's Henry II, time of Henry II, if I'm correct. He wrote the early treatise on English law, the De Legibus Constitutum of Anglia. Fortitude, Sir John Fortitude, author of Constitution of English Law, the Laudabum Legum the Laudibus Legum of Anglia, and the author of The Mirror. Locke appears to allude to the work written by Andrew Horne, which dies in 13. The Mirror, the author of The Mirror, which is a book about the Mirror Princes, in 1328. And then he's going to refer to these. These are what? These are friends of our, they're not ignorant of our Constitution, English Constitution, or English monarchy, and nor an enemy to it. But I thought Hooker alone might be enough to satisfy those men who, relying on him for their ecclesiastical polity, are by a strange fate carried to deny those principles upon which he builds it, whither they are herein made the tools of cunning workmen to pull down their own fabrics. They were best looked. In other words, it is points to Hooker. This I am sure. The civil polity is so new, so dangerous, and so destructive both to rulers and people, that as former ages never could bear the broaching of it, so it may be hoped those who come, redeemed from the imposition of those Egyptian under taskmasters, will abhor the memory of such servile flatterers, who, while it seemed to serve their turn, resolved all governments into absolute tyranny, and would have all men born to what their mean souls fitted them for, slavery. In other words, he's saying that this is the danger. This is that people should deny. Hooker, he's calling Hooker of this. Hooker is the great law, and he's saying that those who want to do this and wants to turn everyone to slaves, they should not do this. You should have avoided the Egyptian. The Egyptians ruled people as slaves. Everyone but the king was slave. This is not to be done. You should not follow the Egyptian example. We should kind of abhor that. In other words, the taskmasters, you fled. The Bible was that you fled Egypt to go to Israel again. So therefore, we should not take the Egyptian as our example, and therefore we should resolve that all governments. In other words, we should not desire to turn all governments absolute tyrannies, and have all men born into slavery. Okay. Here it's 240. Here it is the like and communist question to be made: who shall judge whether the prince or legislature act contrary to their trust? Who should be the judge? Who shall judge whether the prince or the legislature act contrary? This perhaps ill-affected and factious men may spread among the people, when the prince only makes use of his due prerogative. In other words, now this Locke is saying that when the prince uses his prerogative, some troublemakers may say, tyranny, okay? In other words, ill-affected and faction men may spread amongst the people when the prince only makes use of his due tyranny. To this I reply, the people shall be judge. The people shall be judge. For who shall be judge whether he trustees or deputy acts well, and according to the trust reposed on him? But he who disputes him, and must, by having disputed him, have still a power to discard him when he fails in his trust. In other words, I apply to this: the people shall be judged, but who shall judge whether his trustee acts well and according to the trust imposed upon him? But he who disputes him, and must, by having disputed him, still have a power to discard him when he fails in his trust. There's a question, right? It's a question mark saying that it's pretty. If this be reasonable in particular cases of private men, why should it be otherwise in that of the greatest? Otherwise in that of the greatest moment, when the welfare of millions is concerned, and and also where the evil, if not prevented, is greater, and the redress is even redress even difficult, dear, and dangerous. In other words, if it's okay that in private men we kind of, this example here is that when someone breaches, when someone breaches in private affairs, if someone breaches trust, you don't trust them anymore. You remove them from, you don't trust them, and and if you gave them authority, you take it away, right? You did something to do something, you trusted them. Now you don't trust them, you don't give them that thing again, right? If that's true in this, how about isn't it more true in this greater thing where there's the influence? In other words, that the power of those exercising the welfare of millions, like lots of people, are concerned, and where the evil, if it's not prevented, in other words, if you would if trust over small things, like a person who's you're not going to trust him with your, someone who's cheated you or cheats a card, you're not going to play cards with them anymore. Okay, if that is reasonable, then it's also going to be reasonable what he's going to say. What that? Why would it be reasonable to when someone even more dangerous than just cheating you your money now is cheating you of your everyone's lives and situation? It's worse, and therefore the condition is even more cases. And failure to in trying to redress this is very difficult and dear, costly. Dear means costly in this sense. Dear, something dear means it's pricey, expensive. Something is dear means it's very expensive. The cost is high and dangerous. That people can die, right? So therefore, 141. But further in this question, who shall judge cannot mean that there is no judge at all. For where there is no judicature on earth to decide controversies among men, God in heaven is judge. He alone is the true, is true, is the judge of right. But every man is judge for himself. In all, as in all other cases, so in this, where another has put himself in the state of war with him, and whether he should appeal to the supreme judge as jeopardized. So jeopardize again is the case of that, and jeopardize means is going to war. The appeal to heaven, appeal to God means to go to war. It is to put your faith in battle, put the armor on, and go fight, and God will decide who wins. Okay, hopefully God decides right. um, um, in other words, and only God is the true judge. This assumes Locke is a good Christian. No. Here's the problem. Locke's vision here can be cynical, that he says this, and therefore, who is the real judge? Men are the only judge. Because the reality is that in the state of nature, only every man is a judge. There's no judge. Okay, you put your trust in force and like that, but what happens if the wrong guy wins? The words. Even Locke admits that the guy who breaches the trust could ultimately win in that situation, because the person who is right doesn't have enough force to in the state of nature to do it. So where's God coming at the end of time, after everything's over with? In other words, this is that famous line that Machiavelli said, that those who put trust in God to set things right leave this world to tyranny. Right? That's that criticism of Machiavelli to those Christians who say, "Oh, don't worry that don't worry, God will punish everything at the end." Well, no, this leads that in this world tyranny rules. No. So let's not have this foolishness here. Locke seems to suggest that this is the only way, and this is why ultimately, if you see this logic in Locke, this is why Hobbes and Locke agree in that sense. And that for Hobbes, the only solution is this: that you have society, the state, the Leviathan, the state is the means by which to preserve this justice, and justice only really works there. It is the only God there is the mortal God of the Leviathan. Now Locke doesn't want us to be that impious. Locke is not, he doesn't want to follow Hobbes. Hobbes, really could have, if in many ways Leviathan didn't get printed late, and a lot of things he didn't get printed late. In other words, Hobbes had a very bad reputation at the end of and 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 if he didn't die, he might have people might have acted against him. Okay, if he'd lived a little longer, he might have he might have been charged with heresy and crimes against that. You understand? So therefore, Locke is a little bit more careful than that. Locke wants to clothe himself as much as he can in the Anglican Church polity and the English law and the English structures. So he cannot be. In other words, he won't. He won't. In other words, he won't. He will try to make himself appear as close as possible. In other words, as far as from Hobbes as possible, while still being within Hobbes's basic logic, the basic argument of this idea that Locke that he has here. 142. If the controversy arises between a prince and some of his people in the matter which the law is silent, no or doubtful, and the thing be of great consequence, I should think that the proper umpire in such a case would be the body of the people. For in such cases where the prince hath a trust reposed in him and is dispensed from the ordinary rules of law, there, if any man finds himself aggrieved and thinks the prince is acts contrary to it, or beyond that trust, who so proper to judge as the body of the people, who at first lodged that trust into him, how far they meant it should be extended. But if the prince or whomever they be in administration decline that way of determination, the appeal then lies nowhere but to heaven. Force between either persons who have no known superior on earth, or which permits no appeal to the judge on earth, brings properly a state of war, wherein the appeal lies only to heaven, and that the state, the injured party, must judge for himself when he thinks fit to make use of that appeal and put it on him. Now, this is almost like saying the right, this. Whoa! What is this great consequence? No doubts, but this is great consequence. Who is the proper empire? Well, it's the people themselves. But if a prince or whomever they be in administration decline the way of determination to let the people decide this, the appeal then lies to nowhere but heaven. In other words, the king has, by doing this, if he doesn't allow you to appeal to the people, denies you that privilege, then he's acting, what he's doing is, he's not really acting as a private person. One private person implying force on another private person. And this is the state of war, okay? And therefore, force replies with force. And the injured party may judge, in other words, being properly a state of war where the appeal lies only to heaven. And in that state, the injured party must judge for himself when he thinks fit to make use of that appeal and put himself upon it. In other words, you're going to wage war. If you're going to appeal to heaven, you have to decide whether you're going to do it or not. And once you do it, you're in it. Okay. 243. To conclude, the power that every individual gave the society when he entered into it can never revert to the individual again, as long as society lasts. but will always remain in the community. Now, this is again community society, what he's meant by wit. Because without this, there can be no community or commonwealth, which is contrary to the original agreement. So also, when the society hath placed the legislature in an assembly of men to continue in them and their successors, with discretion and authority for providing such successors, the legislature can never revert to the people while that government lasts. Because having provided a legislature with power to continue forever, they given up their political power to the legislature and can never resume it. But if they have set limits to the duration of the legislature and made this supreme power in any person or assembly or temporary, or else by the miscarriages of those in authority have forfeited upon forfeiture, or by determination of set time, it reverts to the society, and the people have a right to act as supreme and continue the legislature in themselves, or erect a new form under the old under the old form, place it in new hands as they think good. So in other words, he ends it on this idea that okay, even if it's an absolute situation, the problem is that when the king or the government violates the principle, they lose their authority. They're in the state of war, and therefore they're not. In other words, it's not the government has ceased to be. As long as the government is rightfully acting, it's lawful and it's there. You can't really challenge it. But then what happens is what happens is that provided the legislature with power to continue forever, and it's until they what? Until they create do something which they dissolve themselves, as he dealt with earlier, right? Uh, um, um, and they cannot resume it as long as the government is in, as long as this is done properly. The people hold it until it's perpetual. This is where he's at his most Hobbesian. This ends at its most Hobbesian sense. He doesn't make exceptions. He doesn't give exceptions. He just asserts it that it's in this situation, and when miscarriage of those in authority, it is forfeited. So therefore, if they miscarriage it, then only then this authority then becomes misfortune. And upon forfeiture, or at the determination of set time, in other words, if the authority gets forfeited, or if the legislative has been set to a time and its time is ended, it reverts back to the society, and to the people have a right to act as supreme and continue the legislature themselves, they act themselves legislature, or they create a new one, or they resort to the old, go back to the old form again. This is how he ends the book. Well, there we are. We're at the end. It's been nice doing this with you. If you have any comments, please give them on the thing, and I'll respond to them when I see them. If you have questions, you can put the questions in there also. Like it or dislike it. If you dislike it, say why you want to do this. You can share it, share this video, and share the whole series to your friends, and put on. So you can share it on social media. Forward it to someone so they get attention. If you're not subscribed, do subscribe. If you know someone you want to get a friend to subscribe, please encourage them to subscribe as well. And if you want to follow me, my social media links are below. If you want to help, if you feel like you want to contribute and help me to do these things, and you want to financial this, you can become a patron either on Patreon or subscribe. Whatever you think. I'm not a picky on that, and I'm not really good at doing that. So well, that's it. Bye bye. Thank you for being with us for this series, and I will continue next with our surprise. We'll see. By the time you see this, the announcement probably will be made. But I'm kind of in the air about something, so we're doing it. Well, take care and bye bye, and have a good day. Bye bye.